Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now when I first purchased this HP Z420 workstation, it had a 6-core 12-thread Xeon E5 1650 V2 CPU installed. This, along with the 64 gigs of 1866 MHz RAM, made it a great starting point for low-cost 1080p gaming, and adding a GTX 1650 to this ex-office machine made it capable of just that. These systems are only getting cheaper and cheaper, and upgrading them doesn't cost too much these days. Mine came with the HP liquid cooler as well, meaning that we can replace the processor with one of the best that the system supports, the 130 watt 12-core 24-thread E5 2697 V2. It's important to note that there are V1 and V2 versions of the Z420 workstation, and both offer different levels of CPU support, so be careful when buying. Ideally, it's the V2 version that you want. Clocked at 2.7 GHz with a max turbo of 3.5, the Xeon 2697 V2 is pretty much locked down inside a system like this, with the BIOS only offering very limited settings. I wasn't able to make any adjustments using other software within Windows either, so a custom Socket 2011 build is what you'll want if you intend to really push a chip like this to its limits in 2023. Still, we've got 12 cores and 24 threads to play with, and after hooking up the 24 to 18 pin power adapter to an aftermarket PSU, slotting this beautiful AFOX 3060 Ti into the PCIe slot, and swapping the HDD out for an SSD, it was time to see what this decade-old CPU could do. According to the Cinebench R20 test, this sits between the i5 10400F and my overclocked Ryzen 5 1600, two of my favourite and previously owned 6-core CPUs. The Xeon is of course a bit older, so it's no surprise that it doesn't sit higher up than this, not at stock anyway, but it's still a decent position to be in after nearly a decade. As for gaming, you might be wondering why I opted for the 3060 Ti. The truth is, I didn't really know what to expect from the processor at first, so I thought using one of the best cards in my collection would be a good idea, to make sure that the E5 was reaching its full potential. It turns out that something like this is probably a bit excessive, but I've played a few games today, some at 1440p and some at 1080p, to see just how well this combo can do. Now in some cases, it doesn't really matter whether or not there's a CPU bottleneck. Some modern games just will not agree with the older CPU architecture. This isn't necessarily true with The Witcher 3 here, I was just pointing that out as it's something you may see in other titles. In The Witcher 3 Next Gen with the 3060 Ti then, I went with 1440p, the highest settings TAAU, SSR low and HBAO+. SSR or screen space reflections was set to low, as choosing high can have a detrimental effect, a noticeable one, on frame rates. Overall, pretty decent average of 75, with a 52 FPS 1% low and a 0.1% low of 31. So overall, very respectable. You may notice a few little drops here and there, which I think can be attributed to the age of the processor itself. You definitely might want to think about a weaker GPU to pair with this thing, but as I said, I wasn't sure what to expect, so I went with this still very capable card. Marvel's Spider-Man Remastered next at 1440p once again. High preset here, TAA and screen space reflections were off. So was ray tracing. 76 FPS on average with a 1% low of 45, but again our 0.1% low did suffer a little bit. For the most part though, and I think you can probably pick this up in the video, the gameplay was fairly smooth and solid, and you can expect at least 60 FPS with a combination like this in a lot of titles today. Now Hogwarts Legacy is definitely one of those that doesn't agree with the older architecture. As I was talking about at the start, we only saw 47 FPS here. This was at 1080p, and we didn't really see much of a difference at 1440p either, which leads me to believe that the older architecture of this CPU is where most of the problem lies, because we're certainly not short of RAM, and at these settings we have enough VRAM too. 47 FPS overall, so it was playable, but in busier towns like Hogsmeade here for example, we are going to see a few unwelcome dips and drops. Forza Horizon 5 tends to run like a dream on most systems, and here that was true again. 1440p with a high preset and TAA, 93 FPS on average with some solid percentile lows. This is definitely a more GPU intensive title, and we have plenty of CPU power here for our 3060 Ti to work with. You may notice from the figures in some titles as well, or the on-screen stats, sorry, that the GPU is only being utilised on occasion at 50 to 60%, which does indicate a CPU limitation as expected. For Grand Theft Auto 5, we were running at 1440p once again with the highest settings. FXAA was enabled, MSAA was off, as it can have a detrimental effect on the frame rates and frame times, and the advanced graphical options were also turned off completely. 86 FPS on average here with some solid percentile lows, so you're not going to have much of a problem with this one, but I do think that CPU is a little bit of a limitation in the busier areas. Overclocking it would definitely benefit this old chip, but we are rather limited with what we can do when using this old HP. Still, if you want to buy one of these, absolutely upgrade it to the max, or even purchase it on eBay already maxed out and add a lower end graphics card, then I think you're going to have a pretty decent time. Red Dead Redemption 2 also runs really well, 1440p with the 3060 Ti and the console equivalent settings, so I was going on Digital Foundry's Xbox One X equivalent settings here. 91 FPS with 65 as the 1% low and a 0.1% low of 55, so very nice here, no problems even in Valentine and Saint Denis. For Far Cry 6, I think this one doesn't really like the older architecture, but we were almost hitting 60 FPS. There were a few little problems with those frame time figures, but overall the game looks really good here and it plays quite well on this system. I think I might test this again with a slightly older or weaker card just to see how well it plays at 1080p, and I think it's a system I want to keep a hold of to see how it handles the latest and greatest releases, especially those coming out this year, because things like Starfield are going to be interesting to test on a decade-old Xeon for sure. Fortnite next, at 1080p we had a few problems with the medium preset, 71 FPS with some okay percentile lows, but I found that the difference between 1080p and 1440p, well, there wasn't really much of one. I know Fortnite's got a bit more demanding lately, but I do think once again that the older CPU is to blame for some of the issues here. Still, it was a playable experience by all means, in my opinion. Finally then, it's Cyberpunk 2077. Pretty surprised by this one, medium preset, medium crowds and the high textures. We were hitting over 60 FPS, a few dips and drops in those busier areas. We actually saw the 3060 Ti hitting 99-100% usage here on some occasions, so I think this is actually quite a reasonable pairing as far as this setup goes for this game. But there will be games like that. There will be games that are definitely more GPU intensive, and I won't mind the Xeon in the system at all. Like I said earlier though, I do think you'd be better off pairing one of these old Xeons with a weaker card and targeting 1080p, but if you can find a cheap workstation with a high core count Xeon inside it on eBay, I do think they're still worth buying if you don't mind the increased power consumption as well. Certainly don't buy one though if you can find an old Ryzen 5 1600 or i5 10 or 11 400F system for less, or you can build one for less. This is definitely more of an enthusiast's plaything in 2023, I think. Probably like most of the tech we check out, but there we go. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you did, leave a like on it, leave a dislike if you didn't, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and hopefully I'll see all of you in the next one.